So I'm going to introduce you to a couple people before our program. Greg Connect, Greg, if you would stand, is our executive director for the state of Florida. Greg has spent his career in water. He worked for 20 years for the DEP and has been with the Nature Conservancy about 14 years now. So if you have any questions about water, he's your man. And then we have two other distinguished guests. Tori Linder. Tori, if you would stand. So Tori is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker and producer. And her latest film, which I bet you're familiar with, is Path of the Panther. Both the Nature Conservancy and Wild Path and many others were able to pass the Wildlife Corridor Act to help preserve wildlife in Florida. So thank you, Tori. We're going to hear from her a little bit. She's going to moderate. And then finally, we've been waiting for is Jason Gulley. He is a Nat Geo, National Geographic photographer, National Geographic explorer. I love that title, wouldn't you? National Geographic explorer. He's also a professor of geology at the University of South Florida. And he has a passion for manatees and marine mammals. Jason, come on up.
I'm a geology professor at the University of South Florida, and about half of the research that I do looks at how meltwater flow through glaciers and ice sheets affects how fast they move and how fast they melt. I typically do that by following the flow of meltwater off of the surface of glaciers and ice sheets and into glacier caves, like this one, where you can see my friend Scott Semper rappelling down a 300-foot deep Moulin shaft inside the Greenland ice sheet. I've spent a bit more than a year of my life working in the Mount Everest region of Nepal, where I've been mapping networks, exploring networks of high-altitude glacier caves like this one, that are turning glaciers into Swiss cheese and literally rotting them from the inside out. This cave actually went underneath of Everest Base Camp on the Nepal side of the mountain, and you can see the Mount Everest right up there in the background, catching the last rays of sunlight of the day before the sun sets, and it starts to get really, really cold up there. Now, the other half of the research that I do typically takes place in or around underwater caves, like this one in the Yucatan Peninsula, where we have this crazy layering of fresh water over top of deeper layers of saline groundwater. Is there another microphone up here somewhere? Try to cut that feedback. So anyway, we get this layering between these, the freshwater and the deeper layers of saline groundwater as the cave systems approach the coast. So a lot of that work has ramifications for freshwater resource management and for trying to understand the physical processes that are responsible for forming caves in different types of environments. Now, because I have the technical skills to work in a lot of underwater caves, I'm also tapped to work on other projects that take place in that environment, like marine archaeology projects. This is a cool project that we did in Southeast Alaska that was funded by NOAA, where we were exploring caves that are underwater today, under the ocean today, that would have been dry during lower sea levels and could have been used as homes by the very first people migrating from Asia into North America. Now, I've always been interested in photography. Like, I started taking pictures as a kid, and when I was in high school, it really turned into a passion of mine. But for most of my career, I've been using photography as a way to communicate with other scientists. See, most scientists are never going to be able to access glacier caves or underwater caves. So I would take pictures of those environments and of my findings in those environments, and I'd publish them in the scientific journals where I was using this like super opaque technical language, which unfortunately is inaccessible to most anybody other than geology nerds, and so that people could see what I saw. And that was really my entire career and my entire life right up until about March of 2020. Now, at the beginning of March of 2020, I was running a multi-million-dollar research program with projects in countries spread all around the world. By the end of March of 2020, global travel was basically impossible, borders slammed closed, university travel policies prohibited me from traveling to countries that were still open. And I watched in a career that I'd spent over a decade building die. Right? It's just like if you have a factory and you shut that factory down and nobody's there to take care of the machines, nobody's there to keep the factory floor running, all of a sudden it becomes really hard to bring that factory back online. And I became super depressed. I spent the first couple weeks of the pandemic sitting on my couch at home. I ate a lot of donuts. I drank a lot of IPA. I watched a lot of Netflix. And then I started to get even more depressed because I began to wonder if any of it even mattered. You see, because I realized as a scientist, and as scientists, we know more about how humans are impacting the planet than at any other point in time in history. But fewer people in America seem to understand or care about those changes than when I first went to college in the late 1990s. So I began to wonder if maybe for the second half of my career, maybe I could use those photo skills that I developed to communicate with scientists, to communicate with the general public, and communicate with policymakers, and share the changes that I've been seeing in different environments around the world, share with people all the reasons why I love these places, and hope that they might love them too, and care about the changes that are happening, and maybe be motivated to do something about it. So I started right in my backyard. This isn't literally my backyard, I wish it was. This is Ginny Springs, it's on the Santa Fe River. If this was my backyard, it'd be amazing, maybe with less people in the summer. But Florida has more than 1,000 freshwater springs. It's the most dense collection of large freshwater springs of anywhere in the world. And every day, these springs are collectively discharging billions of gallons of fresh water to the surface. They support the most important rivers in the state of Florida, like the Swanee and the Santa Fe. And underwater, they're magical places. This is Bronson Blue Spring, and in the summer, on a hot day, it fills with hundreds of gar. If you go there in the summer, you'll find hundreds of gar, and these are ancient prehistoric fish that haven't changed a bit in 65 million years. If you've ever looked at a gar and felt like you were looking at a little tiny dinosaur, it's because they were literally swimming around the ankles of dinosaurs. Places like Naked Spring in Gilchrist County, if you get in there first thing in the morning, when the vegetation is reflecting off of the surface of the spring run, it feels like you're swimming around an abstract painting. Florida's springs and the rivers that they're connected to support vibrant aquatic ecosystems full of everything as common as the common snapping turtle to as mesmerizing as schools of mullet and snook that dart out of the tannic waters of the rivers and into the spring runs where we can see them. Spring runs and their confluences with rivers are some of my favorite places to spend time in Florida because it's here where we start to get a glimpse of the wonder and the magic that must be happening in that black water that we'll never be able to see with our own eyes. Florida's springs are literal portals to other worlds. This is the entrance to Buford Spring. It's in the middle of a swamp near Homosassa on the Gulf Coast, and if you want to dive here, you have to drag all of your dive gear out in the middle of a swamp. If you decide to go, I recommend you choose winter because otherwise you're going to get eaten alive by mosquitoes. But once you have all of your gear on and you drop through this hole in the bottom of an otherwise nondescript pond, this is where you end up. It's a massive chamber that's hidden beneath our feet, and the only reason that we know it exists is because we went there. Florida's springs connect the miles or tens of miles of cave systems that wind their way through the same aquifer that provides the state with the vast majority of its drinking water. I first started cave diving in the late 1990s, and over the almost 30 years now that I've been cave diving, I've seen a lot of changes, many of them negative, that are reflecting changes that are happening in the aquifer that they're embedded within. One of those changes has to deal with the flow of water coming out of caves. Now, if you haven't been diving in caves in Florida, one of the things that's so special about them is the flow of water that's coming out of them in places is so strong that to get into them, it's like horizontal rock climbing. You literally have to pull yourself into these caves, and if you let go, the flow of the water rolls you right back out of the entrance. Now, when I start talking to people that started cave diving in the 1990s, or people that started diving earlier in the 1970s, one of the things that always comes up is that the flow of water in a lot of these springs seems like it's less. We don't have to work as hard to get into some of these places as we used to. And that's because the volume of water coming out of the springs now is significantly reduced over relatively short time periods. Now, the other thing that comes up is that the visibility of a lot of these places is declining. Springs that used to be crystal clear are now green or black. This is Troy Spring. It's one of the largest springs in the state of Florida. It's in the Swanee River Basin. And when I first started cave diving in the 1990s, I could sit in the very spot where I took this picture, and I could look up through crystal clear water, and I could count the individual leaves on the trees around the spring. Now today, this is about as good as it gets, right? It's pea green. I don't want to pretend like Troy was always clear. It's next to the river. It's impacted by floods. It was occasionally green, but it was often clear. And today, when people go to Troy, it's always green. People who haven't been there before think that it's beautiful. But for those of us that saw it, in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 70s, we're super depressed because we know what we've lost. Now, these observations of declining spring flows and declining visibility have led me and a bunch of my friends to start telling literally anybody who will listen that if we don't do something soon, we're going to lose our springs. Then we're going to lose the rivers that they're connected to, and then we're going to lose the estuaries that they feed. And a lot of times people will be like, Jason, that's an exaggeration, that's hyperbole, but I can assure you it's not. And the reason that I can is because it's already happened. This is White Sulphur Springs up by the Georgia state line. This was Florida's very first tourist attraction. If you came here in the middle 1800s, there were hotels around this place. People would flock to it to bathe in the sulfur waters. 1990s, spring water stopped flowing out of this spring. Florida's first original tourist attraction is dead. This is Sulphur Spring. It's located in the city of Tampa. If you went here in the 1920s, it was basically Florida's Coney Island. There was a hotel. It was a resort destination. There were arcades. People got dressed up to go here. It was a place to see and be seen. Right in the center of that spring basin, there was a high diving platform with shows. Well, as it became a destination, and as it became an increasingly popular place to live, and development spread out in the areas around the spring, and poor decisions were made about wastewater management and sewage management, the spring became increasingly polluted. So in the 1980s, the spring was regularly closed due to fecal coliform contamination, and in the 1990s, the city permanently closed the spring to swimming because it was a health hazard. In the year 2000, they built this concrete swimming pool right next to the spring, which they fill with treated city water. What's causing all of this? Well, it's kind of two broad things. First of all, Florida is a super popular place to live. There's something like 1,000 people a day that are moving to the state of Florida. I'm one of them. I'm originally from Ohio. And of course, if you've been to Ohio, you'll understand why I prefer living in Florida. Right? Lots of other people feel the same way, right? But they need places to live. They need water to drink. We need to do something with their sewage. We need to do something with their stormwater, right? All of those decisions ultimately affect the aquifer that feeds springs, that feeds rivers, that feed the estuaries. The other thing is that Florida is a major agricultural state. It's an incredibly important part of Florida's economy. People need food to eat, right? But how and where we put different types of agricultural practices in the state can end up having negative impacts on the aquifer because Florida is riddled with sinkholes like the two that we have in this photograph, and they allow pollution to drain very rapidly into the aquifer with minimal filtration. Now, eventually, all of that pollution, all of those excess nutrients, all of those decreasing spring flows, once they wind up in spring basins, they've been causing proliferations of algae in spring runs, in rivers, in estuaries across the state. This troll hair green algae that you can see in this photograph didn't used to be in springs or rivers 60, 70 years ago. It's being fueled by those decreased spring flows and that increased nutrient pollution. This is actually a picture of one of the last strands of eelgrass that was left at West Isles Peacock Springs State Park just a couple years ago when I photographed it. It's probably gone today. There are a few places in Florida that give us a glimpse of what those rivers and spring runs used to look like, a few places that are still reasonably healthy. Rainbow River is one of them. This is what spring runs used to look like across the state. And the reason I like to show this photograph is because it highlights that those aquatic grasses are the foundations of healthy spring ecosystems, of healthy river ecosystems, of healthy estuarine ecosystems, in the same way that trees are the foundations of healthy forest ecosystems. So when algae comes in and it smothers all of those grasses, it has the same impact on the underwater ecosystem that going into a forest and cutting down all of the trees has on forest ecosystems. That body of work and the photographs that I first started making led to my first digital story with National Geographic magazine. It highlighted photographs that I was making and then featured a lot of the research that I've been doing on Florida springs over the last 20 some odd years. And I knew in the process of working on this story that I was going to have to engage with one animal that spends its winters in Florida's springs, one animal that at the time I was completely and totally uninterested in, one animal that eventually ended up changing my life, and that was the Florida manatee. Now, I had never been in the water with a manatee before I started working on this story. Everything that I knew about manatees could be summed up as they're fat, they're lazy, they're the spirit animal of couch potatoes around the world, and that if I want to photograph them, I need to grab a mask and a snorkel and go out on the absolute coldest days of the year and not move, none of which sounded appealing to me as a cave diver. All right, but the very first time I got into the water with them, I was unprepared for how graceful they were. What I didn't see fat and lazy. I saw magical, I saw graceful, I saw athletic. And I wanted to capture that essence. I wanted to take photographs that showed behaviors of manatees that I don't think that I'd ever seen before. Because at the time, like every picture I'd ever seen of a manatee looked almost exactly the same. So I canceled all my cave diving plans for the foreseeable future, and I started hanging out with manatees. And being the science nerd that I am, I started reading as much as I could about them. I learned a lot. For example, manatees spend 50% of their day sleeping. Like some actually sleep on their back, like this guy at Hunter Springs. I'm more of a side sleeper myself. They have voracious appetites. Manatees eat between 4 and 9% of their body weight in vegetation every day. And for an animal that can weigh over 2,000 pounds as an adult, that gives you an idea of how much vegetation we have to keep Florida's manatees well fed. Manatees are air-breathing mammals. Moms give birth to live young, typically one calf at a time, and the mom nurses the young. Their nipples are located right behind their flippers, so this baby is being nursed by its mom, and she'll continue to take care of that calf for the first 2 years of its life. Of course, like human children, some manatees fail to launch on schedule and hang around a little bit longer than is comfortable for everybody. Right? So then, just when I started to feel like I was being accepted into the Manatees Club, just when I started to feel like I was getting somewhere, hundreds of them started dying over in Indian River Lagoon. Right, in January 2021, an unusually large number of manatees started popping up dead over in Indian River Lagoon. At first, nobody knew what was happening. As biologists went out and they started examining the carcasses, the first thing that they noticed was that all of the manatees were emaciated. And then when they cut open their stomachs and when they cut open their intestines, there was nothing in them. For the first time ever, a record manatee die-off was caused by starvation. What had happened was that as development spread out around Indian River Lagoon, lawn fertilizer, sewage from septic tanks, from leaking wastewater treatment facilities flowed into the canals that were cut to drain all of the wetlands so that we could build houses around Indian River Lagoon. All of those excess nutrients triggered those same explosions of algae that blocked the sunlight to the seagrasses. No sunlight, no photosynthesis, no seagrasses. So in winter, when all of the manatees moved into Indian River Lagoon to their winter habitat, there was nothing for them to eat, and they starved. 2,000 manatees died between 2021 and 2022, smashing fatality records for the species. Now, that led to my second digital story for National Geographic magazine, and initially we kind of focused on, like, man, this is an awful tragedy. What are people doing about it? What's causing it? Right, but as I was working on that story, I got to go around and I got to meet some truly inspirational people. I spent so much time at Zoo Tampa with their manatee rescue and rehabilitation team that they joked about giving me my own pass so that I could badge myself in and out so nobody had to come and get me from the gate. But they will go out and they will rescue orphan manatees. One of the things that happened during this die-off, one of the tragic things that happened, was that manatee moms were able to continue nursing their young until they starved to death. And then a record number of babies flooded the rescue centers that year because they were still able to get out and rescue the babies. So the babies were able to eat, but not the moms. But as I met these people, who were hopeful and inspiring, despite this awful tragedy that was happening, I started to think a little bit. I was like, the world needs a little bit more hope. And it's super easy to get focused on all the awful things and the negative things that are happening in the world. So when National Geographic came back, they're like, we want to do a feature story for the magazine on manatees. We took a more hopeful tone, right? So there's nothing good about 2,000 manatees dying and starving to death. It's an environmental tragedy. But if we go back to the 1960s, when manatees were first put on the endangered species list, there probably weren't 2,000 manatees in Florida to die. Right? So we took a step back. We're like, we've actually, in spite of this setback, done an incredible job at trying to revive this species. Right? So let's focus on that. It's so easy to get focused on all the awful things that are happening. So then I went out and I started looking for other things that were going well in Florida, and I ended up in Crystal River. Crystal River is probably one of my favorite places in the state of Florida, and it's the most famous place in the world for people to go and see manatees. See, manatees, despite looking fat, have surprisingly little body fat and can't survive in water temperatures colder than 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So in winter, when the Gulf drops below that threshold, when the rivers get colder than 68 degrees Fahrenheit, manatees move into springs around Crystal River because the ground keeps that water 72 to 74 degrees. So the manatees can hang out in that warm water until the Gulf warms up in summer. Now, Crystal River, sounds like there might have one time been a crystal clear river flowing through the middle of the community. And if you've been there today, it's kind of hard to imagine. But when you talk to people that grew up there in the 60s, they're like, Jason, the water was so clear, it looked like the Bahamas. Well, again, in the story that we've heard several times already is It became a popular place to live, and poor decisions were made about stormwater management and wastewater management. Crystal River became increasingly polluted, right? That sewage, those excess nutrients triggered the same explosions of algae that choked out all of the seagrasses, that kept the water clean and formed the foundation of the healthy aquatic ecosystem that drew people there in the first place. So eventually, I think it was about 10 years ago now, local community members are like, hey, we want our environment back. And they literally started with rakes. They went out with rakes and they started pulling the algae off of the bottom with rakes. They quickly realized that that was probably not going to work. So what they did was they hired a company called Sea and Shoreline to try to figure out how to fix the underwater environment. It was ambitious. Almost everybody thought it was going to fail, right? Large-scale underwater restoration projects, seagrass restoration projects had rarely succeeded. And they tried and they failed, and they tried and they failed, and they tried and they failed. But every time they failed, they learned one new thing that helped them get a little bit closer to their goal. And eventually, they figured out like the magic combination that they needed to fix Crystal River. And it started with limiting the amount of nutrients that go into the estuary. And then they had to remove decades worth of nutrient pollution. So what we're seeing in this photograph is they're using a commercial dredge to pull like decades worth of muck, which in some places was 10 feet thick. It's got fertilizer, it's got sewage, it's got all kinds of stuff in it. It's a bad thing to plant seagrasses in, and every time the wind blows, it suspends all of those nutrients and it triggers those same algae explosions. After they removed all of that muck, they were able to plant the grasses directly underneath of these metal cages into the sand, and these cages proved to be one of the keys. So they protect the grasses for up to 1 year from manatees and sea turtles, right? And as they do, those grasses are able to sprout roots that go deep into the sand, and then they radiate out in about a 20-foot diameter circle from underneath of those cages. So 1 year later, when they go back and they remove all of the cages, what you're left with is seagrass. They planted over 100 acres of seagrasses. Manatees actually helped spread that grass over an additional 200 acres. Now, I don't want to pretend like Crystal River is going to be as good as it was in the 1960s, right? It's not. But every year I went to Crystal River when they were doing this restoration, I could see a little bit further. The visibility got a little bit better. There were more manatees hanging out for longer. The fish started to come back. Like Crystal River is one of the very few places in Florida that I've been that's better today than it was 10 years ago. Right? So the community of Crystal River has shown us what's possible. They've given us a roadmap for fixing problems that we have in aquatic environments across the state. We just have to get the local communities and governments to demand that it happens in their backyards as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tori. I'm Greg Connect. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Quick background about me. I'm a Florida native. I was born and raised in Polk County. Some of you may remember a place called Cypress Gardens, where the water ski show used to take place in the Delta Wing Kite, so that's my hometown. I spent most of my childhood swimming in lakes in Central Florida and exploring, and spent a lot of time. My kind of job as a young teenager was working in agriculture and citrus and with cattle, and so I love the state and love all of the water in this state.
Perfect. So, Greg, I'm going to follow up with a question from you. So, as we've clearly just seen, Florida's defined by water, from springs to rivers to estuaries and coral reefs. Not to mention the fact that in some parts of the state we stand just feet above our aquifer. Why is this issue of water quality so critically important to our environment and to our communities now? Why do we need to act today?
I think Jason did a great job of showing why. I mean, we know that degradation has been happening. We have examples of places where water quality has been was degraded a decade ago or 2 decades ago. Tampa Bay is a perfect example of that. But it was isolated places, a place here, a place there, or we would have a red tide 1 year, and then it would be 6 or 7 years. We'd see another red tide. Unfortunately, now it's every year in every place. Think about all of the places in Florida that whether it's a red tide, whether it's an algal bloom, whether it's manatee die-offs, it's becoming the frequency and the extent. I mean, Karen said it, we have years, not decades. I mean, Jason, screaming to everyone, pay attention. I don't necessarily take that same approach, but you're exactly right. It's happening, and all you have to do is look, and you will find those places where our water resources are suffering, and we have to do something now, or our children and our grandchildren are not going to have those places that we all absolutely love.
So, Jason, in your presentation, you really highlighted that these issues are widespread and statewide. Looking at the facts and statistics surrounding this issue, I was really struck that 3.6 million acres of estuary across the state are impaired, according to Florida's Department of Environmental Protection in 2024. Can you talk to us, or maybe even show us, if we're lucky, some of the faces of the people who are impacted by this issue?
Yeah, I'd love to. Real quick. One of the things that really struck me when I went to Fish and Wildlife Conservation Committee meetings during the die-off that was happening in Indian River Lagoon was how many people from so many very, very different backgrounds and interests all got together in the same room to try to get the government to do something about this disaster that was happening in their backyard. I can show you some of the different types of backgrounds that people had. And, usually people that you don't imagine, all clamoring for issues. This is Tiffany Sanders. She is a duck hunter that lives in Hawthorne, Florida. She also has one of those permits to relocate alligators. So if you wake up in the morning and there's an alligator in your kitchen or swimming pool or whatever, Tiffany will move that for you. So she, she's been upset because water quality issues are affecting the waterfowl that she likes to hunt. And that was something I heard a lot about at those meetings. About Indian River Lagoon. It's Magnus Soderman. He's an artist and also a fly fisherman in South Florida. He's actually doing okay. The seagrass beds around Miami are actually reasonably healthy because there's a lot of ocean circulation, but his friends who used to guide up in Indian River Lagoon basically don't have any fish to catch in the lagoon anymore because the seagrass, which forms the foundation of that ecosystem, is basically gone and the ecosystem has collapsed. Ryan Norris, he runs Indian River Oyster Company. He supplies, and his company supplies shellfish to restaurants all over the state of Florida. It was actually a really cool thing to go and shoot because I got to sample some of his shellfish. But he is out of business anytime there's a big algal bloom in Indian River Lagoon. So he and his employees can't do anything because you can't harvest shellfish when there's an algal bloom because you can make people really, really sick. So he suffers business losses every time that happens. Something else I heard from other local business leaders, this is Laura Lee Thompson. She is one of the co-owners of Dixie Crossroads. She was historically a commercial fisherman who came off of the ocean to help take over her family's restaurant. It's in Titusville. They have incredible rock shrimp. If you go to Titusville, you have to stop at Dixie Crossroads and try the rock shrimp. But her restaurant has specialized in having locally sourced Florida seafood. But it's become increasingly harder for her to do that because a lot of the nurseries for the commercially important species of fish have collapsed in Florida because of water quality issues. And then finally, I met Haley Hall. She is a young woman who grew up in farm country and around the Swanee River Basin. She grew up on a farm, went to the University of Florida, majored in environmental science, started learning about how agricultural pollution was affecting the water that people were drinking. She's like, wait a minute, I'm on a private well. I don't know that our water's ever been tested. I don't know that any of my friends' wells have ever been tested. So she started working with a nonprofit organization that goes around and tests typically low-income families private wells. Water that was safe when the well was drilled, but now it's become a big problem. And the scale of the problem is shown in this slide here. All of these blue dots kind of in north central Florida, that's water that you could probably drink, right? These yellow dots are if you're a baby or if you're immunocompromised, you probably wouldn't want to be drinking your well water. And these red dots are water that's basically unhealthy for you to drink. So this isn't just something that we see that's causing ecosystem problems, it's also causing health problems for people in rural communities in parts of the state.
It's really, it's really clear the scale and magnitude of this and how widespread it is. Greg, we know the state's been trying to work on this. We know Floridians are aware there's a problem. There have been significant resources over the last decades really focused on conserving and restoring Florida's waterways. My question for you is twofold. Why haven't we seen progress? Why is this still a problem for Florida today? And what is the Nature Conservancy doing to address it? Can you talk to us about some of your solutions?
Sure. I mean, the good news, unlike Jason, that it can't all be doom and gloom, and there really is a really good piece of news here. It is that the state of Florida, the legislature, the governor, are indeed committed to water quality. They have funded, to the tune over the last 7 years, about $3 billion have been allocated to address water quality issues. But to answer your question, why aren't we seeing things get better? Well, the reason for that is the way that those funds are being allocated, the way I like to describe it, is a mile wide and an inch deep. We are throwing money all across the state, as Jason just pointed out, not in a comprehensive, thoughtful way. And so we're not addressing any of the problems. We're essentially nibbling around the edges all over the state. And so that's the biggest problem, is it's not the commitment by the legislature or the governor, it's the way that we're doing that. So what the Nature Conservancy is doing, I'm going to mention 4 different things. One is working on policy, right? We have to change the way that those funds are allocated. So working with the governor and the legislature and changing that that method. The other thing is we're working on the ground. So we like to say we work from the top to the bottom. So we work on policy, but we also have projects that are literally on the ground, innovative projects dealing with some of that stormwater that Jason mentioned. It's not sexy. It's not like stuff that you necessarily put on a poster. I'm always envious of Jason. He's got these great pictures, and all of mine are like, yeah, here's a stormwater pond, right? Nobody wants to see that. So we're working on the ground projects using innovative technology, machine learning, to change the way we manage water and using existing infrastructure that's in place. Right? So we're not coming up with a brand new thing. We're trying to figure out how to take what we already have in place and make it work better. And we're super excited about that opportunity. The third one is that we work with the construction community, the development community, the agricultural community on how do we do better? How do they implement practices, we call them best management practices, to reduce those nutrients? I'll use agriculture as an example. We're working with the agricultural industry on things like soil moisture probes, which, the technology's out there that can tell us when do we fertilize, when do we water, not just put water out there because that's what you've done it for decades. And the last one that's also super exciting for me is we're working on, Tori mentioned the path of the panther. Part of this, and Jason as well, is this, how do we tell, especially legislators, policymakers, and others, what we've lost? How do we demonstrate and show this is what we've lost and this is what we should expect? And how do we tell that story in a way that is compelling, that they will be willing to establish policies, rules, and other things that help us address those nutrient problems? And so I am more than hopeful. I know we can do it, and we've done it. Jason's Crystal River example is one in which we know if we focus, if we do these kinds of things, we can be successful because we've done it.
That's a great segue into my next question for Jason here. How do we make retention ponds exciting?
Oh my gosh.
Just kidding. So much of your work is really helping to make the invisible visible, right? It's helping us see from the surface what's going on below. And as Greg just mentioned, we're doing that with shifting baseline. So I'll admit to my untrained eye, some of your photos of declining springs and algal blooms are beautiful. And so for you as a photographer, as a storyteller, but also as a scientist, how do you navigate that nexus of leaving people inspired while simultaneously ensuring they come home understanding the issue and capable of envisioning what's possible?
Say that one more time.
That will English. Great. Can you talk to us a little bit about how as a photographer, how you utilize storytelling to do exactly what you what Greg was just speaking to? How do we envision a future in which Florida's waters are thriving?
Yeah. When I was a graduate student, there was a seminar that I went to that was given by a professor that was so technical and so boring that even I, as an expert, really just wanted to leave. I remember, like, to this day, it was titled Yttrium Zonation and Quartz Monzonite, and like, that's the most I understood of the entire talk. And you know, when scientists have a tendency to stand up and talk about things that are happening in the world, unfortunately, they tend to do it using super opaque technical language and graphs and charts and things that just most people don't understand. You know, and you know, it's like, so I try to figure, it's like, what is it in the world that people get excited about? What can I, like, what are the different ways that I can get people to engage with subjects? And, you know, I think most people in the world love pictures, and one of the reasons that people love National Geographic magazine is because it's famous for having incredible photographs, you know, that you can connect with emotionally. Now, when we think about pictures that have changed the world, you know, there were pictures that were taken of the Vietnam conflict that triggered entire protests. You know, there are, Lewis Hine, you know, very famously went in and took photographs of child workers in factories, and those pictures, when they went to Congress, basically helped enact some of the first child protection legislation in the US. So, like, I had, you know, this passion for photojournalism because when I was a kid, like, I had National Geographic magazines everywhere. If we went to a thrift store, I'd try to find issues that I didn't have. So when I started thinking about trying to get people interested in paying attention to the world, I just kind of copied what other people were doing. I was like, you know, I could show graphs. The important thing is, like, if you tell a story with a photograph, people are going to not really necessarily have an emotional connection to it unless it's backed up with data, right? So for example, when Lewis Hine was taking pictures of child workers, if there was only like one child working in a factory somewhere in the world, there's not much of a story behind it. But that story is like showing like all of the data in a way that makes it immediately accessible and in a way that people can connect with. So that's what I wanted to do.
Can I'd just like to build on, you know, so there's that piece, and then, you know, there's how do you talk to those policymakers in a way that they care about what we have to say, right? You know, the Nature Conservancy, as an example, standing up and, you know, they would expect for us to talk about nature, which of course we do, but that's not necessarily what is going to drive the policy. Right? So in Florida, you know, the economy is super important, and Jason just showed some of the reasons why his imagery is important. It's not just about the manatees or seagrass or habitat. It's about the people that are being impacted. And I would argue that water and water quality in Florida drives our economy. Whether that is our drinking water, whether that is the fishermen. I mean, Florida is the recreational fishing capital of the world. If we don't take care of our water, that is a huge sector of the economy that goes away. Scuba diving. I mean, we could go on and on about the importance of water. But for policymakers, instead of me going in there and telling them, or I don't tell any of them anything, suggesting, you know, that the environment is important and other things, I have to put it in a context that they care about. And the economy is that piece.
Perfect. Well, thank you both. I think that both of you are clear, as are the science and the data, that we need to act, that we all need to take part in supporting these innovations and advocating for our lawmakers. Can I ask you both to share one tangible takeaway for everyone in the audience as to a practical step they could take in their own backyard? And then we'll open it up for questions.
You start.
I always try to, if there's one thing that you can do literally in your own backyard that would be super helpful, it would be to collect your grass clippings. So if you have people that are out, mowing the lawn, making sure that those grass clippings don't wind up in the waterways. It turns out that they are an incredibly large source of nutrient pollution to places like Indian River Lagoon. That's like a really small, tangible step.
What do you do?
You just have them bagged, and then they can be used as mulch or places where they're not going to end up being moved into storm drains and into the estuaries.
Okay, I'm not going to necessarily talk about your backyard. I'm going to hit two things. One, and obviously we're the Nature Conservancy, and in order for us to do our jobs, we need resources, right? We need funds, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like we don't need them, but we do. Karen mentioned our 2030 goals as an organization. We in Florida have two priorities. We have a land priority, which is to protect the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and we have this water priority. And we estimate in order to, for us to achieve our priorities by 2030, we need about $100 million, right, as the Nature Conservancy to do what we think we need to do. So that's one, right? And I encourage anybody who's interested in any of this, Karen's here, Rebecca's here, reach out to them, reach out to me. I mean, we would love to talk to you deeper about what we're doing. And the last one is just, Jason kind of hit the grass clipping piece, but stay engaged. You being here, just being here is a step, right? And do not be afraid to reach out to your legislative members, to your county commissioners, to your local governments, and tell them how important water and water quality is, because they listen, right? And if they hear from enough people, then I want to believe, and I do believe that they will act.
Thank you both. Do you have any questions from the audience?
I'd love it. I see your hand first, pardon me.
My question is about pesticides, and I would like to know how you deal with the state of Florida regarding pesticides. For one, for example, the paraquat is a very toxic pesticide that is still being used. There's not a federal legislation on it, whereas in Europe it's banned. Can you talk to the issue of pesticides, because that's your policy area? I mean, we have to get the pesticide business out of toxic pesticides. That's a big one. So I'll leave that question for you at this point.
Well, and that's a big one that we should probably connect afterwards. I feel like I'm going back to my previous 20 years of working for this state agency, who's partly responsible for that. It is a big challenge. There's a, not to evade your question, but there's a federal piece that goes along with that, as well as a state of Florida. It's registered, right? I mean, all pesticides are registered for uses. And then, quite frankly, it's finding the alternative that can serve the same kinds of, I don't want to say benefit, but, we've all grown up. Everybody who has a green yard, for example, typically has a green yard for a reason. We're putting fertilizers on it, and we're using chemicals to keep the weeds out. Agriculture does the same thing. We actually manage many of our surface waters through the use of, through herbicides and pesticides. So I don't have an answer for you other than it's, if we can start with nutrients, then I believe if we can demonstrate that, I'm going to use the word restoration of these water bodies as possible, then the next kind of gap is things, and I'm going to go beyond pesticides, are pesticides, microplastics, other micronutrients, and we use that word nutrient, but they're not necessarily nutrients. So.
My question is about pollution. And I wonder, what is the most pollutant there is? Is it chemicals from buildings, or as you're talking about insecticides or whatever it be, or is it human waste? Human waste has medicines in it and everything besides that.
Well, I think the most ubiquitous are nutrients, right? Because and we need them, don't get me wrong. I mean, and plants need them. When I say nutrients, what I'm really principally referring to, although there's others, is nitrogen and phosphorus, right? And, you know, whether that's growing crops, our lawns, those are all nutrients. And as Jason said, if we don't manage the water, then those all get into our surface water bodies. And so decades ago, we used to take our sewage and put it directly into surface water, right? Because we just get rid of it. Well, places like New York and others said, wow, we're seeing huge problems from putting our domestic wastewater, our sewage, right in surface water bodies. We did the same thing in Tampa Bay. And so, you know, we're doing better on that, but we're not managed the rest of when it rains here, the vast majority of that water that runs off of our lawns, all of us, right, goes into a storm drain that goes to a surface water body. It may go to a stormwater pond, but that pond does not hold all of that rain. So we've got to do a better job managing that. And if we can manage that, those other things come along with the nutrients. You know, those might be, like I said, microplastics, some pesticides, and others will, unfortunately, they'll go into the stormwater ponds in other places, but at least we can manage those and they're not in our surface water. I'll let Jason add.
Are there other countries doing it better than us?
Sorry, the question was, are there other countries or, and I have to remind myself, because sometimes I get, like Jason, I get very frustrated. But Florida does an incredible job. We have some of the most, depending on who you ask, some people would say restrictive stormwater rules in the country. And so on one hand, I want to say we're doing an amazing job, but we're not where we need to be. And so that's part of the challenge, right? And I'm not picking on the development community. If any of you are developers, I'd love to talk to you. But, you know, what we hear is, well, I can go to, I'll pick a state. You know, I can go to Kentucky and I can build, and I don't have any of these rules, right? And so you're making it more expensive for us to build houses in Florida. And of course, we all know that, you know, growth in Florida is also that machine that that the legislature does not want, and the governor doesn't want to, slow. So.
What's going on with Lake Okeechobee? I'm sorry, I had to bring this up. With all the runoff from all the agriculture, just a few miles west of us.
Bless you. Oh, no, and I always expect unfortunately, I have a long career working on Everglades restoration. A lot has been done. I mean, again, what I would say is 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, or longer, 24 years ago, when Everglades restoration first started, which is when Congress authorized the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan, that I wasn't sure we were ever going to get there. And, not just what we've accomplished, but what's kind of still to come, which is principally the rest of it is focused on Lake Okeechobee and projects north of Lake Okeechobee, are going to make a huge difference. It won't completely get rid of discharges to Lake Okeechobee. I won't go into all of the details. The water that comes into Lake Okeechobee, it drains a watershed that's huge. And it's north of here. It starts in Orlando, and you can't deal with all of that. But I would say that I am incredibly hopeful. Not only hopeful, I would say in the next decade, Lake Okeechobee, we're not even going to be talking about it anymore.
And what about some of the other springs in Florida? Are there some that are actually remaining clean? I'm thinking of two that are actually commercial. Silver Springs and Wakulla Springs. Are they still very clean, even though they're tourist attractions?
Greg's actually a super amazing person to talk about Wakulla Springs because he lives in Tallahassee, but it is famous in the research community as being one of the very few springs in Florida that has improved. The vast majority of the springs are getting worse, but Wakulla, partly because it's in legislators' backyard, it's received a lot of attention, and it's getting better.
Yeah, I will. Wakulla is another great example of what can be done. Wakulla had this decline, and it was really driven by glass bottom boats, right? I mean, Wakulla is a place where you can go hop on a glass bottom boat, and when you can't see the bottom, nobody wants to get on a glass bottom boat, right? Because there's nothing to see. And so scientists did a bunch of work on, both cave explorers looking at where the water was coming from. We used dye traces. And what the biggest problem contributor to Wakulla Springs and the algal problems both in the spring and the river were was the wastewater treatment plant in Tallahassee had a huge spray field, how they discharged their effluent, right? And so they were spraying the effluent on the ground, not in agronomic rates, not in rates that made sense, but rates to get rid of water, rates to get rid of all of the effluent. And what they demonstrated was that water that we were spraying on the ground was indeed making it to Wakulla Springs. I mean, it was clear. There was clear evidence. So that's now gone. They stopped that, and to Jason's point, if you change the way we do it, we can see recovery. And so that Wakulla is exactly what happened. And other places are seeing the same thing, that we need to get off septic tanks, we need to deal with our wastewater effluent, and we need to address stormwater.
Can you explain, these people probably don't know about Wakulla Springs, you don't know about, because they're most.
Wakulla Springs is just south of Tallahassee. You can correct me.
It is the largest spring in the state of Florida.
Yeah, it's the largest spring in the state of Florida. Probably has the deepest explored lengthwise in the world. And it was owned by Edward Ball and the Ball family, the DuPont family, to begin with that. It was there. It's now a state park. There's a lodge there. I encourage you to go see it because there's manatees there during the winter. It's in old Florida really. It's in Wakulla County and it's in my backyard. So come visit and I'll take you.
I heard in the presentation you said something that I thought was very profound about being a mile wide and an inch deep. And I've seen that so many times in government. You spray when it's so thin that you don't get any impactful stuff. If you could name 3 priorities that we should push to our legislatures, what would those be?
Wow. Okay. So one would be that and I'm going to use the Everglades as an example because I truly believe that while, again, it's taking longer, that the Everglades is a great example of the way we should be thinking about this across the state. What the Everglades has, restoration of the Everglades has, and what I would suggest the legislature should do is, one, prioritize, right? And we can do that in a bunch of different ways, and I would suggest that we can figure that out, both from a science standpoint and other ways. But you got to prioritize, which means everything can't be a priority. We can do it regionally, we can do it a couple different ways. So one is a priority. 2 is you get buy-in or agreement from all of the sectors, right? It can't just be the conservation community coming up with the answer. It's got to be done together. The third one is you got to stay committed, right? It's not a one-year kind of thing. These are big problems that have been created over decades and are going to take numerous years to fix. And then the fourth one would be that you do big projects, right? You can't, you really have to hold everybody accountable, and you have to figure out where you get the biggest bang for the buck. And that may mean I'm going to go buy this person's piece of property, and they're not. And again, there's no reporters in here, right? But we have to make some of these decisions. Jason mentioned the agriculture industry, that's where I came from. I 100% support agriculture in Florida. It's an incredibly important, but there are places where certain types of agriculture in Florida doesn't really fit. And so we need to look at, and the same thing with development. There are places in Florida where a big development community doesn't fit, and we have to make those decisions, and we have to keep landowners whole. I don't believe we should take anything from anyone or whatever, but we have to make those decisions, and the legislature has to be willing to take those, because it's for, I know I sound like I'm soapboxy, but the next governor of the state of Florida, and you're hearing a little bit about my pitch to all of the candidates. The next governor of the state of Florida has the potential to define what Florida looks like for the next 30 years.
I have one more question. We have time for one more. Can we get that?
A bunch of quick questions. First of all, the utilization of AI in predicting outcomes. People won't believe you, but they will believe AI. And I think you can put enough scenarios in an AI that could really astound people. That's one. Two, you haven't spoken much, I don't believe, about the federal government. And this is not a Florida, this is a world problem. And I think there is, unfortunately, there's a pretty big difference in the two parties today on their attitude on these matters. And I think that's a subject worthy, unfortunately, of conversation. Those are the two things I had in mind, AI and the federal government.
Thank you. I'll answer them both quickly. And I did not ask for this question, but the AI piece, this project that we're doing in the Indian River Lagoon is indeed using AI to help us make better decisions. We can't evaluate the amount of data that's out there that AI can actually look at. And so we're really excited about some of that decision making.
AI can predict
Yep.
the disaster we're facing,
Yep.
and we'll be there for real.
Agreed. The second one is the federal government. The Nature Conservancy, as Karen mentioned, is in all 50 states, and we actually have a very strong policy presence in our office is in Arlington, our main office, but we spend a lot of time in the Capitol. And unfortunately, the state of Florida does receive a lot of federal funding for water quality, and it is a challenging time, quite frankly, right now across the country in getting both parties to work together.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to meet you and be with you. And I'd love to encourage everyone to stay in touch with the Nature Conservancy in Florida. We would love to meet you, and as with Karen and Rebecca, we're here to meet you. Thank you.